So welcome. This is a Global Observatory of Long-Term Care webinar organized by the Data Science Interest Group. I'm Madelina Comas Herrera, and the director of the Global Observatory of Long-Term Care. I'm just going to very briefly introduce the observatory. Some of you may be familiar, some of you may not. The Global Observatory of Long-Term Care is a platform for cross-national learning on long-term care. And the idea is that we try to identify key long-term care challenges and showcase how they're being addressed in different countries, localities, but also through research and through methods that can help us build knowledge. And our aim is to facilitate exchange of knowledge, obviously, and facilitate collaborations. This platform is basically aimed at everyone from policymakers, industry, advocates, care professionals, academics, anyone with an interest in long-term care. And it's part of the International Long-Term Care Policy Network. To engage, the best way is to become a member, and all you have to do is fill in a form. You don't have to provide a huge amount of detail, but just enough so we know you have a genuine interest. And I think my colleague Nas will be putting the link on the chat. And you can then share your knowledge in many different ways. So from presenting at webinars to sharing your publications, writing topic guides, writing posts. And through the interest groups, it's a good way of finding people with similar interests. And if you also want to know very minimally what we do, we also have a monthly newsletter. We have a few more webinars planned already. So the next one is very different than today's, is on pensions in Southern Africa. And they're really important as a way of supporting care. And we'll be hearing from researchers in South Africa, East Africa, Malawi. We'll then have another one on pain assessment in long-term care, again, completely different. This is more of a nursing-led webinar looking at pain assessments. We've got one looking at mortality in care homes in Sweden and what structural factors affected mortality. And if you want to catch up with any of our webinars, we share the videos, usually 1 or 2 weeks after, sometimes a bit longer. But we do have, we're building up a database of videos, and we already have 2 videos from the data science webinar in case you missed them. So thank you, and all yours, Sam.
Yes, hi everyone. My name is Sam Rickman. I am the lead for the data science interest group. And I'm a researcher at the CPEC at LSE, the Care Policy and Evaluation Centre. I just wanted to very quickly introduce today's webinar and also the interest group itself. As Adelina says, you can join the interest group, or you can join GOLTC more generally on the GOLTC website. Also, if you want to join our mailing list, but you don't necessarily want to be a member, we are going to have a poll pop up, hopefully around nowish, which will ask you, do you want to join the mailing list? And you can do that. And there are another couple of questions as well. So today, we have got 2 really exciting presentations. I just wanted to have a couple of slides on the policy context and why we're talking about these issues. So very briefly, we all know that in long-term care, there's a big problem with the documentation burden. And I mean, I was actually talking to an old age psychiatrist over the weekend, and she was saying that they think in their team, they spend twice as much time making notes as they do seeing patients. And we think it's worse with social workers, the ratio is worse, and nursing is probably relatively similar. And obviously this leads to problems with job satisfaction and with the amount of time it takes for people to be seen and things like that. Now, over the last year or so, there's been a lot of excitement about the way that AI is going to sort of solve this problem. There's been some positive things and some negative things, but everyone is the move towards using AI in long-term care and in healthcare as well seems almost inevitable, and it probably is. I mean, already these tools are being used, but there are lots of questions about where is it appropriate to use them? How well do they work? What are the biases? How do we even measure the accuracy of things like free text? So we're going to be talking about those things today. So this is a sort of follow-up to the webinar that we had last time. If you didn't see it, as Adelina says, it's on the website. Also, there's actually a GitHub repo for today's webinar, which I will put in the chat in a second. And that's got the link to that video, and it's also got the link to the papers we're going to be hearing about, and a couple of other useful links. Sort of think of it as like the show notes for podcast or something. So last time we heard from Beam, and they are a provider who have introduced this product where basically, so this is in long-term care in the UK, and it's being used already fairly widely, rather than notes being taken in the traditional way. They're recorded meetings, case management meetings are recorded, and then they're converted to text using some sort of speech-to-text model. And then that transcript of a conversation is then summarized using a summarization model. So there's basically two models there, two sort of steps, and both presentations today. So first we're going to hear from Allison Koenecke. Sorry, Allison, you just told me how to pronounce your name. I'm sure I've said it wrong. Allison is an assistant professor of information science at Cornell, and her research interests focus on algorithmic fairness to study inequities. And Allison is an expert on disparities in automated speech-to-text systems. So from Allison, we're going to hear about the first part, about the audio to text, and then the second presentation is from Dave Van Veen, who I'll introduce afterwards, and that will be about the second part, from the transcripts to the summaries. So the way we're going to do this is, so each presentation will be about 20 minutes. If you have questions, it would be great if you could put them in the chat, then we'll have about 10 minutes of questions, but just so we can sort of avoid duplicate questions and things like that. But I mean, we won't be incredibly rigid about that. We can just take it as it comes. So that's it from me. So Allison, over to you.
Great. So super excited to be talking to you all. Thanks again, Sam, for the really kind introduction. And without further ado, let me just get into the meat of what we'll be talking about, which is racial disparities. And as a side note, I'll kind of interchangeably refer to speech to text as automated speech recognition, ASR systems. And we'll start by talking about this piece that came out in PNAS in 2020 that I worked on in collaboration with some fantastic linguists and computer scientists. So a really interdisciplinary piece of work. Where at the time, what we did is we audited 5 different big tech services for their speech-to-text ASR performance. And then in the second part of what I'll talk about, I'll kind of go into all of the latest updates, right? So now OpenAI has a speech-to-text tool. Google has improved theirs, right? There are all sorts of changes in the landscape. And so before we get to this, I'll focus on the first paper doing this audit of these 5 companies, where the way that we did this is we used 2 different corpuses. So these are existing data sets that contain speech data, recorded speech data from a variety of users, or participants rather. But pertinently, they also have a few characteristics. So one is the Coral data set, which contains speech from African-American speakers. And the second is the Voices of California data set, which contains voices from white speakers. And pertinently, these are all in the form of sociolinguistic interviews. So this was relatively novel at the time because it was such a large corpus of what we call spontaneous speech. So this is when people are speaking naturalistically, they're actually having some sort of dialogue with an interviewer, being asked a standard slate of questions, like what did your parents do for their jobs growing up? What games did you like playing as a child? That sort of thing. Where in contrast, a lot of the prior work had been done on read speech, which is basically when you ask someone to read off of, a Wikipedia page. So what we're doing here is we have about 40 hours of this interviewee speech. So again, naturalistic dialogue, much more similar to how you would actually interact with an ASR in your day-to-day life. And there were two other key things that we had to make sure were true in our data, which they were. So one is that they have to be private to these companies, and that they haven't already been ingested as training data. Otherwise, we're just testing on the train set. We're going to get really good performance because the companies have already seen these speech data sets, right? And the other key constraint is we want to actually have some notion of ground truth. So what is actually being said according to human expert transcribers so that we can compare those human transcriptions to what the machine is outputting. Okay, and so we have both of these things satisfied, so we can go into how we actually ran the audit. So for doing this, all we did was we took the audio files, we segmented it up to about minute-long continuous conversational snippets. So we ended at each turn of phrase. For example, when someone stops talking, takes a long pause, the interviewer starts interjecting, that sort of thing. And we also do some matching on socioeconomic traits and diversity traits, so age, gender, and duration. And what we end up having is this matched set of samples for about 2,000 audio files for Black speakers and 2,000 audio files for white speakers. And what we then do is we run all of these audio files through a black box, and each of the 5 different companies gives us some sort of output, right? So they give us some text output, and we want to compare those to our ground truth that we mentioned we had, right? So our human experts, which are hardworking linguistics PhD students, actually have written these transcriptions. But that kind of begs the question, well, how do you actually know how good this thing is, right? So how do you compare the goodness of these text outputs to the actual ground truth? And the actual way that this is done is through a metric called the word error rate. The CS folks in the audience might have heard of the edit distance. This is the exact same thing. In the linguistics world, it's called the word error rate. And it's broadly just the number of changes you would make to a ground truth in order to get to the actual transcription that you have. So you just sum up the substitutions. So for example, substituting that for what, the deletion of is, and then insertion of great. And that's how you get from this, say, Google generated transcription to the true ground truth. That's 3 changes out of 4 total words in the ground truth. So what does that actually mean? First off, important to remember that this is an error rate. So high word error rate, bad, low word error rate, good, right? So 75% is actually terrible, right? If you think about it, if you had a word error rate of 50%, that means every other word is transcribed incorrectly. So 75% is terrible. You might expect to see average word error rates of about 10% for spontaneous speech, and even lower, i.e. better error rates for read speech, where you have a much more constrained set of things that you might be talking about. And so the big headline of this piece is we find that word error rates for Black speakers are about 2 times worse relative to white speakers, right? And we see this across the board. And just so you can hear what this sounds like, here is an example of a white man speaking. And this snippet happens to have about a 20% word error rate, which is reflective of the overall average for white men. You can see the red markings are where this particular transcription messed up.
Well, when I was really young, I had a book of basketball statistics, and I would spend a lot of time reading them. And for some reason, I forget why now, but Jason Kidd ended up being my favorite player.
And in contrast to that, I'll now play a Black woman sample. You can already see there are a lot more red markings. The word error rate is higher, which is, again, in line with the higher word error rate that we saw for Black speakers in our sample. And I just want you to keep in mind as you listen, do you think you would transcribe this more poorly than you would the white man speakers?
And she had these little like snow cone things. I don't even know what it was. But it's not like the snow cones up here. Like, I don't know how to explain it. But, you know, a bag of candy for a quarter, like a full bag of candy for a quarter.
All right. So does anyone think they would have personally transcribed this one worse? Probably not. It was relatively comparable in terms of the type of content they were talking about, the types of intonations that they were using. And yet you do still end up with these machine-generated word error rates that were much worse for Black speakers on average. And this was true across the 5 different firms that we audited. And so this is kind of where most of the news reporting about this ends, right? Most of the news reporting talks about the headlines of there's this racial divide, this 2x worse transcription rate. But the actual paper, and I won't go into it in too much detail today, actually focuses on these kind of 2 sub-questions. So one is, how do we actually know these are racial disparities? Are we sure that this isn't actually geographic based or some other source of disparity? And the second question is, why are we seeing these disparities? And that'll kind of segue into the second half of my talk. So first, how do we actually know that these are racial disparities? You'll see that we actually have really high geographic variation in our study from word error rates. But you'll notice that these three are the cities where our Black speakers are coming from. These two are the cities in California where our white speakers are coming from. We have a broad mix of rural and urban US cities, but you'll notice that the Black speakers in Rochester have a very low and comparable word error rate to their white speaker counterparts. So obvious reviewer 2 comes in and says, well, what if this has nothing to do with race? What if this is just geography? And it's a good question, right? And so what we do in order to get at this is understand a bit more about dialect. Where in America, something like 80 to 90% of African Americans will speak with varying degrees of African American English. And so this begs the question, what is African American English? This is actually displayed with a bunch of grammatical and phonological rules. And so what we did was we actually tabulated, on the order of 50, 100 of these features and had our linguists actually tag many of these audio snippets to see if we could figure out kind of the rate at which these different grammatical and phonological features were happening. So an example might be zero copula, where an African-American English speaker might say they gone without R, A-R-E, which is the copula in between. So that would be a grammatical example. And then phonological examples would be like dropping the D sound at the end of ban. And so what we end up seeing is that there's actually, first of all, a high correlation between the share of these grammatical and phonological features that appear in our snippets and the word error rate. So basically, with more African-American English features, you end up seeing much worse performance across these ASR systems. And in particular, we can map these back to the cities that we were looking at in the first place, right? So our question mark before was Rochester, which had the very low word error rates that were comparable to our white speakers. And it turns out that this actually is probably more a symptom of how the individuals in Rochester in our sample were speaking with many fewer of these African-American English sorts of grammatical features and phonological features, whereas individuals in, for example, Princeville are speaking with many more of these sorts of features, and thereby the ASRs are performing much worse. So that kind of explains the fact that this is in fact racial, and in fact it isn't just a black-white binary sort of difference. It is the sliding scale of the degree to which you are speaking with African-American English in your snippets. So that was kind of answering our first question. The second question then was, why are we actually seeing these sorts of racial disparities? And so this is a slide that I would show regularly when we did this work, circa 2019, right? Which is that ASRs tend to have kind of two pieces that work together. One piece is the acoustic model, which deals with how you're saying different things. And that's the thing that kind of converts these sounds that you make into phones or phonemes. Then you have the language model, which kind of converts those words and thinks about what the next most likely word that you might be saying is. So before I had to do a lot more explanation of language models, now I can kind of wave my hand and say like ChatGPT, and you all know what that means, right? And so what we did is a series of process of elimination tests that I won't go into today, kind of trying to pick apart where in these underlying models we were finding these disparities. And what we found was that most of the errors that we found, these disparities by race, we could attribute to the acoustic models. And so it seemed like there were these differences in syllables and intonations and that sort of thing in the phonology for African-American English speakers that these ASR models were performing especially poorly on. And so in this study, first of all, the big high-level finding is that African-American English speakers were found to have about 2 times worse word error rates relative to white speakers. And this finding in particular was traced to the acoustic portion of the model. But again, we have kind of this new era, right? So where do we go from here? Well, first off, this is like not really a thing anymore, right? So 2019 slide, no longer super relevant because for the most part, actually now modern ASRs are just one end-to-end model. So instead of having these kind of pipelines where first you do the feature or the acoustic extraction, and then you run it through an acoustic model, and then you run it through a language model, now these companies are basically throwing in a massive amount of speech data on one end and just directly getting the transcription through a more advanced architecture on the other end. And so one of the people leading the pack here is OpenAI. And what they actually put in their own paper, very few people actually noticed this. This is the OpenAI written paper that came out in December 2022. They actually mentioned hidden in one of their sections that they actually get complete hallucinations where the model will output a transcript entirely unrelated to the actual audio. So what does this mean? This means that if we're listening to a ground truth transcription, I'll play, maybe I'll start from the end here.
Really, I prefer a really good bakery that has.
That's the end of the audio file, right? So they truly say, if I was gonna blah, 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 and they end it, I prefer a really good bakery that has And what transcription whisper outputs is, I prefer a really good bakery that has a really good sandwich, right? So they're starting to do things like fill in the blank. And you might say, well, that's just the language model kind of going crazy. They're probably, it's a reasonable continuation of the sentence. But in fact, we'll have instances that are not just continuations. So for the sake of time, I won't play this audio. It does end with a sentence, treatments, which came once a month with that. And then Whisper, of course, in their transcription includes, for more information, visit www.fema.org, right? So we're seeing all sorts of wonky behavior. And this is what leads me to the second paper that I'm going to talk about today, forthcoming this summer at FACT, the Fairness and Accountability and Transparency Conference. And what we do in this paper is three things. Firstly, we quantify how often these sorts of hallucinations occur. We taxonomize the types of harms that can come about from these hallucinations. And we're going to talk a bit about kind of what leads to these hallucinations. So why are these actually occurring? And so for this, we're looking at aphasia bank data. And so we end up with on the order of 13,000 audio snippets, which we kind of deal with in the same way as in our 2020 paper. And we have both control speakers in our sample as well as aphasic speakers, right? And what we can do is, again, in a very similar way, compare our ground truth, which Aphasia Bank provides in their data sets, to the Whisper-generated transcriptions. But of course, now we have this question of how do we actually figure out what are hallucinations as opposed to just mistranscriptions? Because, of course, these machines are getting better, but they're still not 100% at transcribing things. So how do you know if something's a hallucination programmatically without having to go through and read and figure out? The key insight that we had at the time of doing this experiment is that actually hallucinations are non-deterministic. So if you run an audio file through Whisper, for example, twice in close succession, hallucinations will often end up being just totally different, whereas the rest of the transcription, even if there are parts that are mistranscribed, will be the same. And so these sorts of non-deterministic hallucinations are what we use in order to just determine which parts are being hallucinated by comparing two different versions of the transcriptions run in close succession. And so what we find using this method is that about 1% of audio files that we ran in this experiment resulted in Whisper hallucinations, and more for the aphasia speakers relative to the control speakers. And in particular, we're seeing that a massive amount, almost 40% of the hallucinations that we documented at the time of this experiment were harmful. And I'll go through the kind of three main categories of harm that are depicted in this chart. So the first is perpetuating violence. And so that's misrepresenting a speaker's words in a way that could become part of a formal record. So you might think about in a courtroom trial, for example, if someone did not say anything about killing anyone or using a murder weapon, but the hallucination is saying something about murdering or using a weapon, that could be a massive issue. You also have inaccurate associations. And here we're talking about this in terms of misrepresenting the state of the universe around you. So who is your family? What are these people's names? Who are you? Where do you live? These sorts of things that are just being entirely hallucinated that could lead to inaccuracies. And you might imagine the downstream harms in patient notes, right? For example, if the patient did not actually say that they're taking this drug, but this particular drug is being hallucinated, or someone is being hallucinated as their parent when they're not actually their parent, that's sort of a concern. And then lastly, we have the set of words about false authority, right? And so this is when the actual speaker's source is being misrepresented. And you'll see this especially with kind of, for example, the www.fema.org example, right? So you could facilitate phishing attacks with this or prompt injection attacks, and also kind of miscommunicate who you are in terms of kind of your positionality based on these sorts of links. So I'm going to go through now, kind of rapid fire, a bunch of different examples of these hallucinations. for each of the overall categories. So the first thing here is for perpetuating violence. One example of this type of harm is actual physical violence or harm. And so the ground truth here is, and he, the boy, was going to, I'm not sure exactly, take the umbrella. And you can see that Whisper actually does, identically perfect 100% accuracy in transcribing this, but then it also hallucinates this entire section in red, where he talks about, I'm sure he didn't have a terror knife, so he killed the number of people who he killed, etc. You also see instances of a different language being surfaced here. And so huge issues with this sort of hallucination, right? In addition to actual violent harms, we also have things like innuendo, so hallucinating entirely the others sat next to her and fondled her, and stereotyping. And this was done across a variety of demographics, but for example, saying that men are homeless or they're mentally ill with a kind of confusing typo that Whisper produces in this hallucination. So those are just 3 examples of perpetuating violence. And then moving on to inaccurate associations, we have things like names being made up. So someone's talking about Christina and saying, Miss, I want you to give $1 to me. We have relationships, so saying that someone is their daughter, and this is not the case. And we have things like health. And again, the entire ground truth is being transcribed correctly. And then the Whisper is ending with, you got quite a handicap. What kind of handicap did she have, right? And because this is, a group very focused on health, here are just 4 more examples related to things that might come up regarding health. So the ground truth in this first example talks about, becoming fairly ill with a fairly serious strain of viral something. And then Whisper hallucinates, but I didn't take any medication. I took hyperactivated antibiotics, whatever that might be. And sometimes I would think that was worse, right? So you can imagine the potential harms if this sort of thing ends up in a patient note. You also have, in the exact same example, a second run of it gave us the hallucination, and that caused a fracture in my membrane, right? We also have things like turning to healthcare professionals who would ground them, even if this weren't actually true. We have an example talking about firefighters, where Whisper then hallucinates an unfortunate arrival of at least one worker who sustained critical shock, right? And so these are all examples that, variously have to do with health, but you can imagine more broadly are also concerning, right? Because they're not just negatively affecting the patient or the speaker, they're also potentially attributing different harms to different people. And so there are just lots of concerns there. And now I'll wrap up by talking a bit about the false authority, so the third big category of harms. And so the first type is kind of hilariously these YouTuber type harms. So you end up with a lot of people who are kind of talking as if they are YouTubers. So you get a lot of, we don't know what the rest of the story is. Keep watching for next week. We have thanks, which again kind of ties into this YouTuber language, like thanks for watching. And here they're also thanking some mythical electric unicorn. And lastly, with websites, similar to the FEMA one, but there are also websites that are generated that are not real. So as of the last time I checked, snowbible.com does not exist. You're welcome to buy the domain if you would like. But these are the sorts of harms that we're talking about when we say this could lead to massive issues with phishing, or just with, especially children, for example, ascribing more authority to the person who's speaking because they seem like perhaps an influencer. Okay, so the next set of questions are then, why does this actually occur? And very quickly, we'll just speed through the fact that this is based on some of the modeling choices made by OpenAI, and secondly, kind of the actual speech data attributes. So firstly, we do actually have some explanation for this sort of YouTuber language, so this third big category of harms that we identify. And this is that actually Whisper was used on 1 million hours of YouTube data. And that was then used in order to train GPT-4. So there is a reason for this, it turns out, thanks to contemporaneous reporting. But more importantly, it seems like a lot of OpenAI's modeling for Whisper is very much based on similar technology to their GPT modeling, right? And so we didn't see any hallucinations at the time in comparable ASR systems. So across Google, Microsoft, et cetera, we didn't see any of these sorts of hallucinations. And in particular, we think this does have to do with the modeling choices that Whisper allows for. For example, Whisper allows users to do some prompting. So if, for example, you're talking about someone named Anne, and they're spelled A-N-N without the E, you can prompt that every time you hear the name Anne, make sure you spell it A-N-N and not A-N-N-E. And this can be very useful for transcriptions. But the fact that they're allowing this sort of prompting does mean that they're having probably a lot of similar architecture embedded in the Whisper system, as is similar to GPT. And despite having no prompting and this randomization, an attribute that has to do with how random your output should be, which is called the temperature. So we're effectively setting this to be like, do not ever randomize the responses. We're still getting hallucinations, right? And so that seems to be a problem that needs to be resolved in Whisper's modeling. And then second, I mentioned that we're going to talk about the actual speech itself. And so it does seem like longer pauses are one thing that is very much correlated with hallucinations. And so you'll know, of course, that aphasia speakers tend to speak with longer, what we're calling non-vocal durations. So that might mean longer disfluencies, essentially where you're hearing background noise instead of someone actually vocalizing and speaking. On top of that, you can also see that aphasia speakers who end up having Whisper hallucinations have a larger share of those non-vocal durations relative to the aphasia speakers who are not resulting in hallucinations from Whisper. And likewise for our control speakers. And if you want a regression, you can have a regression, right? So we do in fact have this significant positive effect for the share of non-vocal durations in a logit predicting whether a hallucination would be generated by Whisper. Okay, and so to wrap all of that up, hallucinations may exacerbate biases. This is massively problematic for individuals who might speak with more of these non-vocal disfluencies. We, of course, only studied individuals with aphasia, but this could very well be true for other sorts of language or speech disorders. It could be true for the elderly, non-native language speakers, and so on. And of course, there are many, many downstream implications for each of these different types of harms, right? We focused on health decisions, but also in the hiring world, in the legal world, in education, all of these sorts of domains are going to be negatively impacted by having these hallucinations, especially as they're disproportionately affecting certain demographics of speakers. And of course, the big issue here, again, is it's really hard to actually detect whether or not hallucinations are occurring. And so these really do seem like the next big issue to solve. And so lots of folks are complaining about this. Lots of folks are writing new papers about this. And so to maybe end with a few calls to action, firstly, we really hope that more diverse data can be collected. So we're not just flying blind with a lot of these smaller versions of different languages, especially low resource languages. And I have a related paper on this. More resources need to be invested to ensure that these systems are in fact fair and broadly inclusive, right? This isn't just a data problem, it's also a people problem, and making sure that the people in the pipeline are aware of the different types of inclusivity that they should be thinking about when auditing their systems. Publicly reporting progress over time. It would be great if the companies themselves could do this instead of academics. And lastly, of course, learning from progress being made in other domains, algorithmically, legislatively. There are lots of things going on in the US in terms of laws that are now regulating AI used in hiring, which oftentimes uses speech to text, and also thinking about these different sorts of captioning tools and how those might tie into the Americans with Disabilities Acts and that sort of thing. Okay, so with that, I will stop for questions.
Great, thank you so much, Alison. That was really interesting. We've already got a few questions in the chat. In the interest of time, I wanted to zip through them, but the first question actually is from Ben Wallace, and I think Ben, maybe you could ask it yourself because I think you have a better sense of what you're getting at than I do.
Yeah, sure, yeah. I mean, I pressed enter too early on the question as well, which is why I put it in two parts. Hi, Alison. We're big fans of your work, actually, at NHS England, and we've been reading it. And we have someone who's doing a PhD who reproduced one of your studies as well. We want to validate these systems, and before we're going to buy them, we're thinking we might try and produce our own data set of speakers to do that. Do you think that's a good idea? What do you think some of the challenges might be of us trying to do that?
Yes, absolutely a good idea. And the main reason you'll want to do that is basically something called distribution shift, right? So if all of the data that has been used to train these different ASR systems is very different from your actual use case, that might lead to kind of disproportionately incorrect transcriptions when using the system. And so it's often a very good idea to sort of test with your own set of data that's much more reflective of the types of speech that you'll be hearing day to day in your data set, and use that to test on these different ASR tools that you're considering. So when generating the data set is kind of the two main things that we looked at for our first paper as well. So you need to make sure that you're not testing on the train set. So you want to be, using your own internal in-house data, of course, caveat with all of the various privacy constraints that you might have, right? And secondly, you'll want to make sure that you have solid ground truth transcriptions. So that means having potentially multiple human experts going through and making those transcriptions. And finally, when you're actually going through and calculating the word error rates, when you're trying all of this, one thing to pay attention to is data cleaning. So we didn't talk about this at all, but basically, how do you want to deal with filler words or ums or us? Or you might have some patients, for example, for aphasia speakers, there might be a lot of repetition or stuttering. And so how do you want to deal with word fragments, repeated words, that sort of thing? That's all going to affect the final numbers. But once you kind of solidify that cleaning process, you'll be able to get a range of word error rates for your specific sets of data that would be reflective of your actual use cases. And that can help inform kind of whether or not those word error rates are in line with what you would hope for. And in particular, if they're, for example, better than the average human transcriber or previous ASR tools you've been using.
We had another question, which I think I can just ask from Swati Vermani, which was, has this been tested across a range of transcribing tools?
Yep, so just the range that I mentioned. So that would be around those 5 big tech companies in our first study, as well as RevAI, and is one of the newer ones that we tested. So yes, across a range, but mostly the hallucinations are focused on Whisper, as that's the one ASR tool that does seem to consistently result in hallucinations.
Yes, and we were talking about that, weren't we, before, about the sort of trade-off between hallucination and accuracy. Thanks. The next question was from June. Did you want to ask it, June?
Yeah, sure. So this is a very interesting topic, and I really appreciate the amazing presentation. And then my one question is that in case of this hallucination, probably like generating the contents by themselves using the large language model, the transcript of the timestamp might be affected, right? So in case what do you think like to resolve this issue? And then probably when we doing the more shortened segmentation for text, speech to text, is that like one way to address this issue, or what is your thought?
Yeah, it's a great question. Definitely, there are lots of different ways to do segmentation, and that seems to also affect kind of model performance and that sort of thing. Of course, if you insert like a 2-hour-long set of speech, that's going to perform differently relative to 30-second chunks. I will say that a lot of the audio ASR tools that we're looking at are generally trained on these kind of like 30-second to minute-long windows of audio files. And so oftentimes that's kind of the space where they perform best. And it's also useful in kind of auditing for the rate of hallucinations, because if you're just inputting 1 2-hour-long set of speech, it's kind of hard to identify where the hallucinations might be creeping in, right? It's harder to see where pauses end and start, that sort of thing. So definitely that's fantastic to do, that sort of segmentation. The one caveat, of course, is one thing you mentioned about timestamps is oftentimes timestamps can be kind of wonky in real world data, right? So you might end up actually, cutting in the middle of a word or in the middle of a phrase. And so there is a lot more kind of human validation that needs to go into the sort of data cleaning necessary in doing that sort of segmentation.
Awesome. Thank you.
Great question.
Thanks, Allison. Okay, I can see, Ben, you've got a follow-up in the chat. Do you want to just, if we could try and cover that in about a minute and a half, and then, because I want to make sure that we do have time for Dave's presentation and for questions as well.
Yeah, sure. Okay, sometimes we're only making a transcript so that we can make a clinical note. We're only interested in the clinical note, and then the transcript's going in the bin. In those cases, some people argue that word error rate isn't what you want to measure it by. You want to measure it by some kind of semantic measure. Do you agree?
It's a great question. There is a measure called paraphrase error rate, which is very different from things like word error rate, sentence error rate, character error rate, which are otherwise used. Where paraphrase is basically like if you had a human paraphrase this text, does it roughly get at the same directional meaning? And so there, the thing that matters much more is, are you accidentally like dropping a double negative or including a double negative where you shouldn't? And so that sort of error rate, which requires a lot more human labor, because you actually have to like understand and figure out how you're paraphrasing things, is often much more realistic for settings like what you're talking about here. So definitely, I think the kind of end conclusion is keep humans in the loop. Make sure that you have humans validating everything that you're putting out, especially for patients to see. And that's really the kind of main takeaway here.
Great.
Thanks so much.
Thanks, Allison, and thanks so much. That was a really, really interesting presentation and very cutting edge. So very exciting to have you here. And there was one more question in the chat, but it actually, I think, relates. It's a really good bridge between what you were talking about and the next presentation we're going to have from Dave Van Veen. Dave, I'm hoping, by the way, maybe just you can try and share your screen while I just say all I'm really going to say is, so I mean, the question was about the impact on chatbot performance, or the idea of, as you said, Allison, having humans in the loop. I mean, there is this the way that we're seeing these products being used, and certainly the product we heard about last time, humans are very much in the loop, and there is an opportunity for sort of correction of the output. But ultimately, at some point, you do end up with these models that produce ultimately a free text summary. You do end up with some text output, and then you have this question of how do you evaluate that? So Dave Van Veen, Dave is a final year PhD student in Stanford's electrical engineering department, and has written a paper with some colleagues, which is very impressive, very pragmatic and sensible, and I think quite positive as well, approach to how you analyze and how you evaluate the performance of these summarization models. And also, it's the only paper I've ever read, at least in any reputable journal, which contains the sentence, "You are a mystical wizard in Middle Earth." So worth reading for that alone, but not only for that. So yeah, Dave, take it away. It'd be great to hear about your paper.
Yeah. Thank you, Sam, for the generous introduction. And yeah, really excited to speak to this group. Allison, I enjoyed catching at least the back half of your presentation and all the questions that came out of it. So yeah, excited to be speaking with you all. And I'll hope to run through my slides quickly so we have plenty of time for discussion at the end. So I'll talk about adapting LLMs and how we can actually outperform medical experts for the task of clinical text summarization. And I want to just start off by acknowledging all the amazing people that contributed to this project. And doing this type of translational research is really a team effort, incorporating the knowledge and context understanding of physicians, and having that conversation with myself as an NLP researcher. So yeah, really excited about the team, and I'll just kind of cover two papers actually. This one was presented in an NLP conference. I'll just kind of use it to set up a framework for why we might want to adapt language models, and then we'll get into the paper that Sam had invited me for, where we're kind of evaluating those against medical experts. But first, just to motivate the problem a little bit, so text summarization plays an indispensable role in the practice of healthcare. Currently clinicians spend significant time sifting through vast amounts of text and EHR data and summarizing relevant information, such as compiling diagnostic reports, writing progress notes, or synthesizing a patient's treatment history across different specialties. So this documentation burden has been drastically increased by this proliferation of electronic health records that in the US we've seen mainly in the last decade. And this is directly linked to clinical burnout. So some alarming statistics that we came across in our research is that for every hour a doctor spends with their patient, they might spend up to 2 hours on documentation tasks. And these tasks can consume up to 60% of a nurse's shift. But crucially, these tasks divert attention from patient care, and there are, dozens of studies out there showing it leads directly to worse patient outcomes and decreased job satisfaction by clinicians. In recent years, large language models have gained traction for natural language understanding and generation. And naturally, with so many LLMs, there's been extensive work on these general tasks, but there's still quite a large gap between general tasks and achieving clinical readiness, especially in the sensitive domain of healthcare. Our methods for NLP require a higher standard. So the aim of this work is to bridge that gap between the theoretical promise of language models and their practical utility, specifically for summarization. But what do I mean by summarization? We'll just start off with a tangible example, where after a radiological exam, such as the CT scan of the brain, a radiologist will write what's called the findings section of a radiology report. And this contains all the detailed notes and analyses from those images. Now, subsequently, the radiologist also creates a summary of these findings in an impression section, and this contains all the salient, actionable information that other clinicians will actually reference. So there are many types of summarization tasks like these. I kind of picked out a baby example, but they are very non-trivial, especially when you just consider the sheer volume of documentation that a clinician faces amidst their demanding responsibilities. So our goal, or kind of our question, is how can we use LLMs to more efficiently process this information with these summaries? And a naive approach that we thought of to start was like, oh great, well we have all these pre-trained models. Let's just do end-to-end fine-tuning of all the model weights. So imagine you have a bunch of finding sections as inputs, and you want to learn how to summarize them or map them to outputs of impression section. And let's just train all the weights of our network of this model, and it'll work great. But there are a few issues here. So the first issue is just that these models are vastly large. And this kind of causes some downstream effects, which are that end-to-end fine-tuning of a model can be very time and compute intensive. There are only a few companies or places that really have access to these types of resources. But even if you had all the time and compute in the world, really a barrier that we might run into next is just that we need a lot of data to update all the weights of this network to achieve good performance for our summarization task. So this end-to-end approach has some issues, and this kind of motivated this first work, which was from last spring, with two motivating questions. One, how can we kind of adapt these language models in a more data efficient way? And the next question is just how well will it work? This is, again, maybe 15 months ago, which feels like the dinosaur ages for some of the language models, and at least with how fast some of the technology has developed. But at the time, we really had no idea, what the performance would be compared to a clinician. So I'll introduce this RAD-ADAPT framework, where we considered data efficient adaptation across two different axes. The first axis are just using different models, or I really should say they're the same model, but they've all been pre-trained on different sets of data. So on the far left, we have T5, which has been pre-trained on a general corpus of text from the internet, C4. And moving to Sci5 here, we have the same model, it's the same architecture, same size, but it's been additionally pre-trained on PubMed abstracts. So maybe it has more intuition for scientific text. And moving over further to the right, this ClinT5 model has been additionally pre-trained on clinical notes from the MIMIC data set. So very loosely, as you move from left to right here, we can imagine that it's the same model, but it's been adapted for our task of radiology report summarization just by the fact that it's been pre-trained on kind of more relevant data. So this is one axis for adaptation. Another were just different methods that we might use to prompt and tune our model. And I'll start off with the first kind of subclass of those methods, which is just discrete prompting. So discrete prompting will keep the weights of our network are entirely fixed. And here we're just adjusting what kind of text we provide as an input prompt to the model. So the most naive thing you could do here on the left is just say, here's my finding section, impression, colon, and kind of hope the model, completes the impression section. But you imagine it might be better to provide the model with more context, such as, hey, this is a radiology report. We'd like for you to summarize it here in the middle. Or even if you have access to a handful of examples, even like 1 or 2 examples of findings and impression section, maybe you can include that in the prompt to your model and then give it the finding section you actually want to process. And maybe this kind of these in-context examples will help the model to understand the task at hand. So this is one set of methods called discrete prompting. For adapting our models. But there are also, kind of another subclass where we call parameter efficient fine-tuning methods. And I'll just kind of talk about one of these, which is LoRa here. And here we are going to update the weights of our model, but we're only going to update a very small subset of them. So LoRa, what it does is we have all these pre-trained weights of our model here in blue. And then we're actually going to inject some additional kind of adapter weights here in orange. And these adapter weights are very small, less than 1% relative to the overall number of weights in our model. But now that we have them, we're going to take maybe a few hundred training examples and kind of update the weights of just the orange weights and keep the blue weights frozen. So given these, few maybe 100 examples that we have access to, it doesn't require much data, but we can learn how to adapt this model by updating a small subset of the weights for the task of radiology report summarization. So stepping back now, we have these different models and methods for adaptation. And I'll actually skip all the results for this paper because I really just want to set up the next one. And I'll tell you the punchline that the more we adapt, the better performance we achieve. So this was, this was one finding, but we also kind of found that these radiology reports we generated were actually quite good. So, we were curious, this is a really good initial work. How can we step beyond that? And, the limitations of this framework are perhaps that as far as models are concerned, we really only considered one type of model, which is T5. And these are all very small, less than 1 billion parameters, whereas most language models might have tens or hundreds of billions of parameters. Now, we did learn a little bit something about how to adapt our models in a very lightweight way, so that was useful. But another limitation is that we only looked at radiology reports, and we'd really like to understand more generally how we can summarize more broad clinical tasks. So this was the motivation for our second work, which I'll kind of provide an overview of now, where we're going to expand the number of tasks to look at, and I'll cover these in just a second. We'll also incorporate the state-of-the-art models that are both open source. I can use them on my own machine, or proprietary models, such as GPT-4. And we'll also use similar methods for adapting these models to our different summarization tasks. So the first step of this framework is just looking at all these different combinations of models and methods, data sets, and we're just going to quantitatively evaluate using NLP, natural language processing metrics, just as a proxy to determine, okay, what's the best model and method across all these different options. And once we've identified that with these quantitative metrics, we're then going to take it one step further with a clinical reader study, where we'll evaluate this against the summaries of medical experts, and then we'll perform a downstream safety analysis to understand how this might impact clinical care. And I'll just pause for a second and kind of emphasize that a lot of the NLP works that at least I've seen in my field typically kind of stop with these NLP metrics. But we believe it's really important to kind of move beyond that and think about how we can evaluate things in a clinical context and get real physician feedback. So these tasks that we looked at, well, first we have radiology reports. This is the same example as before, you're familiar with. But we also considered patient health questions as submitted from an online portal. These questions are often very ambiguous and verbose. And the goal is just to compress all of that into a very condensed question, so the clinician doesn't have to sift through all this and they can just read and respond to a condensed question. Now, another data set we considered were progress notes from the ICU. This contains a lot of just notes of the patient's progress, different medications they may have been supplied with, blood work and results. And the goal here is just to extract, kind of a list of different problems that patient might be experiencing during their stay in the ICU. Now, the last data set we considered are just all these transcribed conversations between a doctor and a patient. And the goal here is to take all of that conversation and kind of sift out an after visit summary, an assessment for that patient. So I know I'll just kind of take a step back and discuss some of our anatomy for how we prompted our models. And this gets to the reference that Sam made before my talk. So we'll first start off with a prompt. Say you are an expertise medical professional to kind of guide the model in the medical direction. We'll then say, hey, here's an instruction. We want you to summarize this radiology report. And then if we have any examples, in context examples to provide, we'll do it here to help it guide word choice. And then we'll of course supply it with the input that we wish to be summarized. So one thing that we found in our work, and I just want to highlight kind of the bottom portion of this table here, is that supplying the model in a prompt with some type of expertise to start off was actually very helpful. So you can see across these different NLP metric scores that telling the model you are an expert medical professional gave us the best performance, the highest scores. Whereas giving it no expertise was worse, and telling it that you are a mystical wizard in Middle Earth actually gave it the worst performance overall. So it seems kind of contrived here that we're supplying this expertise, but little tricks like that in prompting can make a meaningful difference. So now that we've talked a little bit, and I kind of skipped over some of the models and methods details, which are all available in the paper. But I just want to pull out maybe one or two results from the quantitative evaluation now. And the first one is just that very simple adaptation can offer drastic improvement. So say we have this prompt anatomy over here on the left, and the question is, how big of a difference do these in-context examples really make? And the answer is quite a bit. So you can see on the horizontal axis, we have number of examples. And notably, even providing with one in-context example compared to 0 delivers a drastic improvement across all of these different models. And I think this just goes to emphasize that in our work, it's really helpful to go beyond zero-shot prompting of these models and think about lightweight adaptation approaches. But further, as you provide it with more in context examples, you can imagine that we get even better performance across all of these models. So that's a really nice result, because we don't require any updating the weights of our model. We just intelligently prompt it with some examples, and we get much better results. Now, a lot of this was just evaluating different models and methods. So I kind of want to pull out one tool we use for considering that. And here we're going to compare two models, GPT-4 versus Vicuña, and we'll evaluate it on a few hundred different samples using our quantitative metrics. And the question is, on what percentage of samples did GPT-4 outperform Vicuña? And here the answer is 71% of the time GPT-4 gave us a better answer by using these metrics. And if you compare all of these models in a head-to-head fashion, we start to see this hierarchy develop where maybe GPT-4 obtains some of the better performance, and then your performance kind of decreases as you move down the line. So this is just one way to compare different models. And we had many other comparisons in the paper, which I will kind of skip over, and we'll just get right to the punchline, which is that GPT-4 with in-context learning works very well. So this is going to be the best model and method that we'll then evaluate in our clinical reader study with 10 different physicians, where we compare this best adapted model, or summaries from the best adapted models. Oh, pardon me. Against summaries from the medical expert. And to compare these attributes of these summaries, we'd really like for our summaries to be complete. They should have all of the relevant information. Our summaries should be correct. We don't want any factual inaccuracies. And summaries should also be concise, right? We don't want any superfluous information in our summaries. So here's an example of what a physician, our 10 physicians looked at in the reader study, where they were considering some input, and then they have two summaries, A and B, and they were just asked to kind of grade the comparison of these summaries, which was more complete, correct, and concise on a 5-point Likert scale. So now we'll display these results where blue kind of indicates that the model is better, and red indicates that the medical expert performed better on these different attributes. And initially, I'll just say that we were hoping for zeros. We thought, how cool would it be if a model could have performed similarly to a medical expert? But surprisingly, for all of these different attributes and tasks, a model actually performed better. Notably, completeness. Our summaries were more complete. And you might think, oh, well, maybe the model is just generating more text. But we actually find that's not the case, because these summaries were concurrently more concise than the human, while also being more complete. And we also see that model summaries tended to be more correct and have fewer errors than summaries from the medical expert. So while on average, model summaries were better, I just want to demonstrate, this chart kind of shows for each of these three attributes, the model versus medical expert, which the reader preferred. And again, we have a bit of a right skew on all of these overall, but I want to emphasize that there are, many instances in which the medical expert summary was preferred. So it's not absolutely better, just better on average. And in the interest of time, I might just kind of skip over that slide and say that now we have all of these different reader scores from our different physicians. We're curious, how do these NLP metrics, how useful are they when we consider about physician preferences? So we looked at, and I didn't describe any of these metrics. They're not particularly important for our talk, but when you look at the four of them, for completeness, correctness, and conciseness, and correlate them with our reader scores, and correlation again is from -1 to +1. we see that, in the best case, we maybe have a correlation of 0.2. So they're positive, which is good, but they really do a poor job of capturing, all of the potential physician, aligning with physician preferences. So the takeaway from this is just motivating, work in the field of NLP to extend beyond these quantitative metrics for better evaluations that align more strongly with physician preferences. So now we'll just move on to the third part of this framework, which is the safety analysis. And one thing we did is we took a lot of these samples and we just kind of compared the two summaries from our medical expert and best model, and we literally color coded them, individual words and phrases, to get a better understanding of how they compare. So blue, purple, and green here indicate some form of correct text, and orange might be incoherent or filler, but then red text is just blatantly incorrect. So here's an example where the medical expert referred to the right frontal lobe instead of the left frontal lobe. So we can say the medical expert made a laterality mistake here, and we have many other examples of these for the different types of data sets. I'll just refer you to the paper for many instances in which the model or the medical expert, perform better than one or the other. Another thing we might consider is what's the potential medical harm of using these summaries in clinical practice. So there can be harm contributed by using a summary from a medical expert or by using summary from a model. So we're just curious, using the Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality spectrum, what would be the likelihood of potential harm and also the extent of possible harm. And we see across both of these that the model summaries would actually, less likely to contribute harm and also at a lower extent. So this was kind of an encouraging result that, helped align with our reader scores from earlier. We also considered fabricated information. And we chose to actually define this in 3 different ways. So the model can hallucinate, which is commonly talked about, but we define that as the model generating text in the summary that maybe has nothing to do with the input. It's just kind of coming out of thin air. The model can also modify facts, which is more related to the previous example we saw, where instead of saying, right frontal lobe, it says left frontal lobe. So it can modify an existing fact in the input. It can also, maybe do a poor job of interpreting ambiguity. So, when we compared the expert versus the model summaries, we find that the model does a better job or contributes less fabricated information in all of these individual categories. So some takeaways here. One, we provided this framework to adapt and evaluate more general models for clinical tasks. And we focused on this task of summarization, but we believe this framework could be, applied more broadly or hopefully be useful to other tasks beyond summarization. Another takeaway is just that, a lot of these models, if you adapt them in the right way, can outperform medical experts. So, it's a really exciting finding using all of this retrospective data. And I think some of the opportunity now is integrating these models prospectively and evaluating, how that actually provides value in real-time clinical care. So thank you all for your attention, and very excited for any questions you might have.
Thanks so much, Dave. Huge amount to think about there. Really interesting stuff. We have a couple of questions in the chat. I think one actually you've addressed. The first one, I think I might piggyback off this as well. So the question is about the actual data itself, the format, how long the reports were, and just on that, I mean, so you mentioned in the paper that the dialogue is much longer than the rest of the progress notes and the And I wondered if, you know, I mean, clearly, and then you haven't applied the completeness, correctness, and conciseness metrics to the dialogue. Is that something that you think would be practical to do? I mean, are there challenges with these kinds of metrics when the data becomes longer, or is it? Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great question. Thanks, Sam. So yeah, I think you know, one consideration here is that we you know, yeah, for a task like the dialogue where you're summarizing a lot of text, you know, we were asking each physician to do like 100 samples for each of the tasks. So you can imagine doing 100 of these would just be very cumbersome. And obviously not every medical center or every lab will, you know, it's a lot of resources to evaluate everything with a human. So yeah, I think it's really important to kind of consider how we can evaluate these more efficiently. And there's been a lot of work with maybe using like secondary language models to kind of gauge physician preferences. So yeah, I think more efficient evaluation is important. Ideally, you have a dozen physicians with infinite time, but certainly, you know, this can become more difficult with the, you know, the larger amounts of text to process.
Thanks, Dave. So, I mean, so the next question was, and please, anyone, do feel free to raise your hand as well. But so the question in the chat was, so it asks, so the first part of the question I think you addressed, but the second part was about did prompt engineering change the rate of hallucination at all?
Yeah, great question. So we didn't spend too much time on prompt engineering, to be honest. I think that, so how I kind of assess this is I tried different things for expertise, instruction, like a couple of different permutations, and I saw, oh, this one maybe gives me better scores on this, like these NLP metrics. So you maybe try 3 different versions of expertise. So I was we didn't spend a bunch of time here. And I think it's encouraging that we can achieve such good performance without spending a bunch of time on prompt engineering. It can be quite cumbersome. And I believe that in the coming years, prompt engineering will become less important. Because I think it really depends like how the model was trained and different types of data it was used. But I believe we'll kind of abstract this type of engineering away pretty soon. So yeah, we were not very thorough, and thankfully we didn't need to be.
Great, thanks, Dave. All right, we've got about 1 minute left, and there's one question in the chat. Ben, do you want to ask it quickly? That's your
Sure.
question.
I just wanted to understand a little bit more about your NLP quantitative metrics. What were they?
Yeah, great question. And I see if I have anything in the appendix quickly.
Was that LLM as a judge stuff, or is it not that?
No. So yeah, we use these 4 different metrics. So blue and Rougel, which are kind of, so all 4 of these metrics are reference based. So we have some reference summary and we're comparing how good is our generated summary using this as like a gold standard reference. So blue and Rougel are syntactical metrics. They compare how similar are the actual words that are used. BERT score kind of captures semantic similarity between your reference text and your generated text. And then MedCon looks at only the medical concepts within, so it kind of abstracts away all of the other words. So yeah, but I think the important thing to consider too is that the higher the scores are here for the quantitative metrics, the better, or the more similar our summaries are, the better score you get. But we've already shown that like the reference summaries, like, for these medical experts can have errors. So optimal score is probably not 100,
Sure.
We might want to have like an 80 or something. So that's a little bit of nuance that is maybe difficult to parse out.
Thanks, Dave. That's a really interesting point. And perhaps a good note, definitely a good note to end on, because we have got over time, and I promised I wouldn't. Yeah, I won't say anything else except thank you so much both to Dave and to Alison for two really, really fascinating presentations. Really appreciate it. It's great to have you both here.